Hello guys and welcome back. This is the third video and actually the last video in the full stack application that we are creating using MERN stack. We are creating a multi-election voting application using the MERN stack. That is MongoDB, ExpressJS, React.js and Node.js. This is the third video, but in the first video we created all the pages using React and also designed all the pages to make sure they are responsive. So that was what we did in the first video. The second video, which I released a few days ago, we created the API and also connected to MongoDB and also connected to Cloudinary as well. So we save our data, that is the elections, the candidates, the voters. We save them in the MongoDB database and also save our images on Cloudinary. So if you haven't already, I'll leave a link to the first video, that's the React tutorial, and I'll leave a link to the second video as well, that is the Node Express API that we created and connected to MongoDB. All right, now this is the third video, and in this video we are actually going to connect the client side, that is the React, to the Node Express API. Okay, so that is what we are going to do in this video. All right, so without wasting any time, let's dive right in. All right, so here I am in the main project folder. As you can see, there's the client side, the React project, and there's the server side, the Node Express API that we created in the last video. Okay, I have tutorials on both. Check the description for a link to either of them. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually open the main project, that is this folder. I'm going to open that in VS Code. All right, so here we are, everything looking good, and I'm going to go ahead and open two more terminals. The middle one is going to be for the server, so let me cd into our server. Okay, and the first one is going to be for the client or the React side, so I'll cd into the client side right here. I hope that makes sense, and I'm actually going to name this so that you don't get them confused. So I have the client at the top and this is going to be the server. Okay, so the third one will be for, switching between them and installing some dependencies whenever we need that. Okay, and actually I'm going to go ahead and cd into the client, and I'm going to install Axios. Okay, Axios is what we are going to use to communicate to the API. Right, so I'll npm install Axios. All right, make sure you are in the client. Okay, make sure you cd or change directory into the client. All right, now here in the client I'm actually going to npm start, but before I do that I have to do npm run dev. If you can remember, that's what I use. If we check the package.json in the server, that's what I use to run my application, that is the API. Okay, I use nodemon index.js here, which is npm run dev. I hope that makes sense. So with npm run dev, let's see what happens. Our server should be started, of course, and that means we are able to communicate with the MongoDB database as well, because if you can remember, we actually connected before starting the server. So if the server is running, then that means we are successfully connected to MongoDB. Okay, so if we check our MongoDB database right here, there's a cluster, we can browse collections, and we are going to see our database right away. And if you can remember, we actually created some users, some voters. We created some elections, we created some candidates as well, and they should all be present here. Okay, I'm not going to delete them, we are actually going to make use of them, so I'll just keep them here. Okay, I think we created some voters as well. Let's check that. Okay, so we created 3 voters. Okay, and so that is it. What else? I'm going to show you what we did here as well, that is in the Postman. Here you can see we have all the endpoints for all the controllers that we created. And if you check here too, you can see we have an environment variable right here that is localhost 5000/API. So I'm actually going to copy this and then make it an environment variable here in the client. So I'm actually going to create .env. Wait a minute, isn't there a .env here already? Okay, so I don't have any .env. So right here, directly in the client, I'm going to do .env, and this is going to be React App API URL. That is my environment variable so far, and I don't think I'm going to add more. All right, so let's hop back into the client and do npm start. Okay, so npm start in the client to start our React application. It should take a second. And I think we have a very simple bug here, and that is if you come to the page that is the sign in page, this should be auto-focused. Okay, that should be auto-focused. So it's not a bug, but I think we did that in the clients, and so I don't know how it is not showing. Okay, let me correct that real quick. Actually, I'm going into that page already regardless, so let me just enter into the register page. This is where we are going to start everything. This is actually the sign in, so that is the login page, and so the input here should have autofocus. Okay, right here. All right, so when you come to the page, the email input should be autofocused. I hope that makes sense. All right, so we are going to start with actually registering voters. Of course, we have Axios installed already, and to register a voter, of course, we are going to create a function right away, but I want to show you something in the server side real quick. If we check our routes to register a voter, we are going to send a post request, and since we have some parts of the URL here already that is in the client.env, we have http localhost 5000/API. So there's a part of the URL we are going to communicate to, and so all we have to add is /voters/register, and that's what's going to get us to the controller that is going to register the voter. I hope that makes sense, which is this controller that we created, right? I'm not going to go into details because we have a full video on the entire API, but I just want you to understand what's going on here. Okay, so let's get back. I'm going to close this login. Let's get back into the register, and I'm going to create a function here called register user or register voter, and this is actually going to take in an event because I want to prevent defaults. So I'll say e.prevent default, right, to prevent the default submission of the form. And so this button here should be a submit form, and on the form I'll say on submit we should call the register voter function. I hope that makes sense, right? So in here I'm actually going to put this in a try catch in case we have any errors, and if we have any error, remember we have this error paragraph here, right, which is there by default, and I'm going to show you quickly right here. Okay, so initially it shouldn't be there, of course, but if we get any error in the catch, then we are going to put that in the paragraph. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So I'm actually going to have a state for that. I'll call this error, then set error, use state, and it's going to be empty initially. Okay, the initial state is going to be empty, so this is where we are going to actually display it. and we are not going to display it unless we have something in it. Okay, so if error is true, then we are going to show. All right, so that's going to be in the catch. I'll say set error, and that's going to be the error. I will say error. All right, so error response data message. Okay, and these are actually error messages that we are sending from the API. If I show you that real quick, you're going to see that we actually were passing in some error messages in case we encounter any. Okay, in case our user or the voter trying to register enters any invalid inputs, we actually send an error feedback. I hope that makes sense. Right, so that is the error we are trying to get here, and we are putting that or displaying that right here. And we should of course bring in Axios. So import Axios from Axios. All right, so let's go ahead and actually make this function asynchronous, and because we are going to communicate with the API, which communicates with the MongoDB. Okay, so it's going to take some time. So this is actually asynchronous. All right, so let's await Axios dot post. Remember, it's a post request. Okay, as you can see here, there's actually a post request to register a user. Okay, so in here we're actually going to have our process.env dot react app API URL, and remember we have to add voters and then register. I hope that makes sense. And the next argument is the request body, okay, which is whatever we got from the input. Once a user is registered, we want to navigate to the sign in page or the login page. So I'm actually going to bring in use navigate. So I'll say navigate should be equal to use navigate, which should be automatically imported for me right here, coming from React Router DOM. So once a voter is signed up, I'm going to navigate to the login page, which is the home page. I hope that makes sense. And this should actually not be inside an extra object. The user data itself is an object already. Okay, right here it's an object, so we can just pass it in. I hope that makes sense. All right, so that's it. Let's try registering a user and see what happens. Now if we check our voters collection, you can see that we have some voters or some users already. We have John Doe, we have Ernest Achiever, and then we have Jane Doe. Now Ernest Achiever is the only admin. As you can see, that its admin is true for Ernest Achiever. The rest are all going to be false, and I showed you how I did that in the API video as well. Now John Doe has voted in one election. That's why the voted election array has one element. That's the ID of an election, same as Jane Doe, but Ernest Achiever hasn't voted in any of the elections so far. So I just wanted to draw your attention to these voters that we have in here. And so let's try registering the voter and see what happens. Now if I send this without filling the fields, we get filling all fields. Okay, so we should have some things in the inputs. I'm going to have a user called James Kofi, and I'll do james@gmail.com. I'll do james123 for the password, and for the confirm password, I'll actually not have it the same as the password itself. Okay, so these passwords do not match. Now let's see what happens if we send and we get passwords do not match. Okay, so we are getting the correct error response from the API. Right now I'm actually going to go ahead and make sure the passwords do match. So password 123, that's the same as this. And actually I'll go ahead and try registering a user who already exists. Okay, so I'll register a user with this email and let's see what happens. So I'll do john@gmail.com. Now this email already exists, so this sign up shouldn't work. Let's see what happens. we get email already exists. And if I come back here and refresh our voters collection, let's see what happens. We have John Doe, right? We have Ernest Achiever, and James isn't registered. Okay, so in the API video, I made sure we checked all these things before we go ahead to actually register a user. Okay, so now I'll change this to James, who does not exist. That's the email, does not exist. So if I register, this should actually work, and we have been redirected to the login or the sign-in page, right? So if I come back to the voters collection, you should have a new voter. Okay, so we have the full name, James Kofi. We have james@gmail.com. The password is hashed and everything is looking good. All right, so that is it for the registration of a user. We should go ahead to the next thing. I think we are completely done here in the register. So I'm going to close that and then open the login. You should be able to log in users. All right, so let's have a function here, and I'll call this login voter, and this is going to have an event as well, and it's actually going to be asynchronous, and I'll pass in the event. Okay, right, perfect. Now I can just say e.prevent default and have my try catch. Okay, now in the catch, as you know, we are going to catch any error from the API. So let's have an error state here. Set error, use state, and an empty string. Okay, so down here in the catch, I can say set error to be whatever error, response, data, message is coming from the API. Okay, nice. Now, of course, the error should be displayed in here. If you have any error, then we are going to render this paragraph tag, and in the paragraph tag we are going to have our error. Beautiful. All right, so if we check back, this is what we have so far, looking good. And so in the try, do we have Axios? We don't. So I'm going to bring in Axios from Axios. Okay, I'm actually going to expect something back from the API. Okay, so I'm actually going to save this. I'll say response should be equal to await axios.post. Okay, there's actually a post request as well that we are sending. If you check, we have posts. Okay, that's the request that takes us to the login voter, and the path here is voters and then login. Okay, so /voters/login, that's the path, right? So you say process.env.react app API URL. Okay, and then we add /voters/login. That takes us to the login user controller or the login voter controller, and then we are going to pass the user data as the second argument. Okay, perfect. Now, as I said, I'm going to expect a new voter, and if you check the API, which I recommend you check the API video. Okay, that's what we are sending back right here. We are sending back a JSON which has the token, the ID, the voted elections, and then the is admin. Okay, so that is what we are expecting back, and that is an object. And so I'll say new voter should be equal to our wait here response dot data, which is the object that I just showed you. Now once I get this object, I actually want to save it in the local storage and also save it in the Redux store. Okay, so we have this Redux store here. This is what we have. Okay, so we have some stuff here that I'm going to remove. We're just using it to test when we were creating the front end, but initially the current voter is going to be like this, right? And this is what I'm trying to update. So once I once I save this in the local storage, I'll update the store as well. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. I'll say save new voter in local storage and update in store, and update in Redux store. Yeah, that makes more sense. All right, so to save in local storage, I'll say local storage dot set item. I'll call this current user. You can call it current voter, whatever. And since we are getting an actual object, we cannot save that in the local storage unless we stringify it or we turn it into a string, okay, a JSON string. So I will say JSON dot stringify and then pass in our new voter. I hope that makes sense. And this is going to be saved in the local storage. And as I'm saying, once we are done, we should store this in the Redux store. So I'm going to bring in this patch. I will say, let me actually try whether it will be imported for me by default. So I'll say use dispatch. It sucks. I'll do that manually. Use dispatch coming from React Redux. Oh boy. Right. And what are we trying to dispatch? Now, if I check the vote slice again, I have, where is it? I have this reducer here to change the user. Wait a minute. For some reason, I didn't create the reducer to change the current user. Okay, so let's do that real quick. I'll say change current voter. Takes in a state and an action, of course. And I'll have a comma. And that'll be state dot current voter, and that'll be equal to action dot payload. Very simple. I don't know why I didn't have this, but yeah, there you have it. And so let's get back in here, and that's what we are trying to dispatch, by the way. So we are going to dispatch that action that is inside the vote actions, and we'll say change current voter and then pass in the payload, and that's going to be the new voter. That's the payload we are passing in. And once we know that this person has successfully logged in, we are going to go ahead and navigate him or her to the results page. I hope that makes sense. All right, so I think that's it. Let's go ahead and try logging in and navigate is not. Of course, I'm going to bring in navigate from React Router DOM. Let's use navigate. Right, perfect. I'll just save this and then come back. Wait a minute, did I capitalize that? Of course not. All right, so let's go ahead and log in as any of the users or the voters that we've registered so far. I'm going to log in as James since that's the voter I just created. So the password, if we enter any wrong password here, we get an error. Of course, of course, we should have on submit and passing the login voter function, okay, on the form. Remember, you have to do that, okay? So now James at gmail.com, and I'll pass in the wrong password here. If I try to register, invalid credentials, okay? But if I enter James123 and then log in, we should be redirected to the results page, meaning we have successfully logged in. And of course, if I check the application and the local storage, you can see that we have current user, okay, and the current user is actually James. If you check the ID right here, it ends with C040, and that should be the ID for James, okay, right here. Perfect. So we are done with the login function as well, or the login functionality. And the next thing we have to do is to actually get all this information from the database, okay? So let's hop into the results page and do that real quick. Here things should be simple. I'm going to, of course, remove the dummy array that we used. That was just to have something so that we can style our pages. But here we are going to get something from the database. And so let's check the routes. We are going to send a get request to the path is going to be /elections, okay? And that's how we will be able to get our elections or to hit the get elections controller. Okay, so let's have a function. I'll say get elections. You have a synchronous. Let me put this in a try catch. Okay, let's get used to the try catch. And here I'll just log this in the console in case of any error. All right, now I'll wait. Wait a minute, response. I'll wait Axios. Of course, I should bring in Axios. I don't know why it's not being imported by default. Wait. Why am I typing so bad? So Axios.get. We are sending a get request to, of course, we should bring in React app API URL and /elections. That should bring us all the elections that we have in our database. Of course, we are going to send this with credentials. Okay, so the second argument that we need here is going to be an object, and we'll say with credentials is going to be true, and headers is going to be authorization, and then we have bearer and our token. Now, of course, we should go ahead and bring in our token, and to get that, I would say token should be equal to, we're going to use selector from React Redux to bring in our token. So I'll say use selector from React. Oh, why are these things not being imported for me, man? Use selector. This is interesting. Right? Use selector from React Redux. And to get the token, I'll say state vote dot current voter. And in there is where you get a token, right? I have a question mark here so I don't get any errors. And so yeah, I'll get a token and then pass that in as well. So once we get any response, I'll update the elections state right here. So I'll say set elections and then pass in response dot data. Or if you want, we can actually go ahead and say elections should be equal to await response dot data and then pass that in here. Okay, I hope this makes sense. And for this to work, we are going to use effects and just say when the page loads, basically when the page loads, then we call this function. Okay, right, and the dependency array here is going to be empty. I'll only want to get the elections when the page loads, that's all. So when the page loads, I'm going to call the function to get the elections, right? Now if I save this and then come back, let's refresh and see what happens. And nothing seems to be happening. Now if you check our database, you can see that every ID starts with an underscore. Okay, every single ID, right? So in here you can see that we are having the ID here, so we have to give it the underscore, and we should actually go into the result election component, and I'll have the underscore here to get the ID. And since I'm using the ID without the underscore in here, I'm going to go ahead and alias it to be called ID. Okay, so now let's see what happens in our app. I'm going to refresh this, and I don't think I'm not getting anything. Wait a minute. Access error. What is that? We have a response data message unauthorized invalid token. Okay, really? I logged in, so how am I getting invalid token? Right, so let's see. That is in the results. To get the token, state vote, current voter, and then the token, right? And you know what? Initially, this should actually be coming from the local host. Okay, instead of these empty, you know, instead of this empty objects, we should get what we saved during the login. We should get that from the local host. Sorry, the local storage. Pardon me. So local storage dot get item, and we called that what? Current user. Okay, if we check our local storage, that's what I called it right here. Application local, so we have current user. So that is what we should get. And actually, since this is a JSON string, we should actually pass it. Okay, what we saved is a JSON string, so we should pass it. All right, so this is what we should get from the user object saved in the local storage during login. I hope that makes sense. So now the token shouldn't give any problem, as we saw, and so we should actually get the elections that we have in our database so far. Although we are not getting the candidates, we have the elections, and that is something. Okay, so I'm actually going to go ahead and right here, I'm going to make sure everything looks good. I don't think we have any candidates. Let's check. Okay, we have Daniel Vigno. That is the only candidate we have. Now here you can see that we have election candidates, which is coming from the dummy data that we had earlier in the React video. And so here, of course, we should fetch the candidates that belongs to this particular election. Okay, and so we have the idea of the election, and so we are going to go ahead and use that to fetch the candidates. Now we have a route for that in the API, and that is what get election candidates right here. Get candidates of election. Okay, that is the controller, and it's a get request. The path is selections / ID / candidates. Okay, so let's quickly do that real quick. I'll have a function here. I'll say get candidates. Come on, const. Get candidates. It's asynchronous. Going to put this in a try catch, and in case of any errors, I'll just log that in a console, man. Right now in the try, I'll say response should be equal to await. Of course, we should bring in Axios. So let's await Axios.get, and we need process.env.react app API URL /elections / the ID of the election. So that's going to be the ID that we have here / candidate, right? And we are going to pass in some options here. I'll say with credentials should be true, and headers should be authorization, and I'll say bearer token. Now we should bring in our token. That's the token of the voter who has logged in, and so that will be use selector, right? Now state vote current user, or is it current voter? Yep. And then the token. Perfect. All right, so now this request should be sent and we should get something back. Okay, so I'm actually going to have a state here. I'll call it well, let's see, election candidates. Oh, come on, it's a state. So I'll just set election candidates, use state, and it should be an array, of course. So here I'll have candidates be equal to await response dot data, and say set election candidates be equal to the candidates that we got. We are going to use effect to actually call this function. So once this component mounts, we are going to go ahead and say get candidates. We'll call that function. All right, so if I save and then come back, now we have Daniel Vignon, who is the only candidate in the entire application. Okay, as you can see, that's the only candidate. I hope that makes sense. All right, so of course the total votes is not working. Okay, the total votes here is not working well, and that is because we have to calculate the total votes correctly. In here you can see we have a figure here that is not correct. That's just a dummy figure that I entered. And so once we have the candidates, let's go ahead and actually calculate. I'll say calculate the total votes in each election. All right, so I'll say for, I'll have a for loop here. Let I be equal to 0. I should be less than candidates dot length. So for each iteration here, as long as we have candidates, we are going to say set total votes. I'm going to say set total votes, and I'll get the previous state. And I'll say the previous state plus candidates. That's the current iteration of the candidate. And I'll say plus the votes of that candidate. I think that's vote count, right? If we check the database, every candidate has vote count. Okay, so we are just looping through all the candidates in a particular election, and we are adding all the vote counts that they have. Okay, so that we can correctly show their percentage in the votes. I hope that makes sense. So now if I check the application, we have 100% for this candidate. Okay, since he's the only candidate and he has some votes, he has 100% of all the votes in that particular election. I hope that makes sense. Once we are done with the entire application and starts, adding elections, adding more candidates, you are going to understand this more. Okay, but if you watched the API, you probably should understand this as well. All right, so I think that is all for the results page. Of course, I think I should have a loader. I don't know if we created a loader component. So I'm going to have a loader .jsx, and I'll just paste this here. That's the loader. And I'll go to the CSS to paste some. I think I'll paste it right before the media queries. Right here. And I'll paste this for the loader component. All right, so that is it. Now I'll bring in that loader. So in So in here, in the try, I'll have a state, of course. I'll say it's loading, set is loading, and it's going to be false. But once we start getting set is loading, it's going to be true. And once we are done, I'm going to set it back to false. Actually, I have that in here. Okay, and that is going to be rendered next to the article. So if it's loading is true, I want a loader. I hope that makes sense. So let's actually test this out. Come on. So let's test this out. If I refresh, it loads, and then we have our elections. I hope that makes sense. All right, so that is it for the results page, at least for now. I think that's it. In case we have any issues and we have to come back and fix, we'll come back and fix it. But for now, that is it. Now let's head on to the next component, and that is the candidates component. Okay, so I'm going to close the results and its component and the CSS as well, and I'll head on to the candidates page. So here we want to get the candidates for a particular election. Okay, and as you can see here, we actually get the ID of that election. If you check the URL, you can see that we actually have that ID of the election. All right, so with this controller right here, that is the get candidates of election, we can actually get all the candidates that belongs to a particular election. Okay, and this is the path with a get request. All right, so let's do that, and I'm actually going to rename this to be selected election. All right, just an alias. So down here with this dummy data, I'm going to remove that. I'm going to remove the dummy data here as well, the import. All right, so I'm going to get candidates, and this is a synchronous function, and I'm going to have this in the try catch. In the catch, I'm just going to log an error in the console. Okay, now in the try, I'll say response should be equal to wait axios.get and process.env.react app API URL, right? And of course, we are going to the elections, and we need the ID, which is the selected election. That's the ID that we are bringing in here from the params, and then we say candidates. Okay, so this is the route that I'm trying to hit. Right, where is it? Right here. Okay. All right, so that is the path. Now we need some options. I'll say with credentials should be true. I'll have some headers as well. Authorization. What is going on? Authorization is going to be bearer token. And of course, we have to go ahead and bring in the token. And so we are going to use selector, state, vote current voter, and then we get the token from that. Okay, so that is our request being sent, and we can actually get the candidates here. Or you know what, I'm going to have a state right here. I'll say candidates, or let me just see what I called it down here. Yeah, candidates, right? And then set candidate, use state, and initially it's going to be an empty array. Okay, so here say set candidate, and then pass in response dot, come on, response dot data. All right, so with this we should be getting all the candidates that belongs to the election that I clicked on. Okay, now use state and Axios are not imported. And for use states, I'll get it right here. Okay, and of course for this to work we have to call this function. Okay, and that will be called once this component mounts. Okay, so I'll use effect here, fixing a function. This is an anonymous function, and then the dependency array, which is going to be empty, and I'll just call get candidates. All right, so let's save this, come back, and we have a candidate here. Okay, now that is the only candidate we have. If I check candidates right here, that is the only candidate we have. That is Daniel Vignon. And if I copy this URL right here, you can see that's actually the image of the candidate. I hope that makes sense, coming from Cloudinary. All right, so far we have just one candidate, and we will be adding more candidates, but for now I think we are good to go. Okay, let's proceed. Now one thing is, if I select this, I should have some information that says there are no candidates for this election, or inactive election, something like that. You understand? Because there are no candidates. Okay, so let's actually go ahead and have that. Let's mess with this header right here. So I'll just cut this and check if candidates dot length is greater than 0. If so, then we want to render this, vote your candidates, blah blah blah, right? But if it is not, then I'll just paste the same heading but have different text in here. I'll say inactive election, and then for the text I'll say there are no candidates found for this election. Please check back later. I hope that makes sense. All right, so if we come back, let's see what happens. Inactive election, there are no candidates found for this election, right? But if we click or select an election with some candidates, we actually get vote your candidates. I hope that makes sense. Also, I want to check if this particular or the logged in voter can actually vote. Okay, now remember in the response that we get when we log in, okay, when you log in as a voter, you actually get a response, and that response is being saved. Wait, what is this? Each child needs a unique. Okay, candidates 39. Let's correct that quickly. Yeah, underscore ID. Okay, so if I refresh, I shouldn't have any errors. All right, so what I'm saying is, when you log in, let's get back here, and when you log in, you get a response, and that response has voted elections of you, the voter that just logged in, right? And these voted elections will have all the elections that you voted in. So what we are going to do is check if this selected election is in this array. If it is in the array, then we know you've already voted in this election. And so that is what I am going to check right here. And so to do that, I'll actually get all the voted elections. So voted elections of this particular logged in user should be equal to use selector state dot vote dot current voter voted elections. Okay, that should give me all the voted elections. The array should be plural. And so down here I'll use if to check. So if voted elections includes the current selected election, if so, then this person has voted. Okay, so let's have a state up here. I'll call it can vote, and then set can vote. Use state, and initially it's going to be true actually. Okay, so initially you can actually vote, right? But if the selected election is found in the voted elections, then we know you cannot vote. I hope that makes sense. So here I'll just set can vote to be false. Okay, so here I'll check if can vote is actually false. If it is, then we are going to have some message in the header. So I'll just copy this header right here and then paste it right here. Okay, right? But if it is not, then we are going to actually render something. So if can vote is false, I'll say already voted, right? And in the paragraph, I'll just say you are only permitted to vote once in this election. Please vote in another election or sign out, right? And so let's see, this is where it ends. And so if it is true, then I want to render everything that is in here. Okay, so I'll actually have this in a fragment. I'll wrap it in a fragment. Okay, so that will end at, that should end here. Perfect. So I'll end it here, right here. I hope that makes sense. Starts here, and of course I have to close the parentheses, the curly brackets. Okay, now let's see. So far, if we check our database, we have some voters, and those voters, like John Doe, has already voted in one of the elections. So John Doe has voted in one of the elections, and I think this is the Legon election. If we check the elections, you'll see that that's actually the ID of the Legon election. And we have a candidate for the Legon election. This is actually the Legon election. Okay, so let's actually log out. And okay, I'll have to sign in as John Doe. Right now, we do not have access control. We will get to that real soon. But let's log in as John Doe. So that is John 123. Let's log in as John Doe and see. Now, if I try voting in this election, I actually have an error for some reason. Okay, how could that be? How could that reason be? Error, too many re-renders. Okay. You know what? Instead of just using this if, I'll just get a voter from the database. Okay. So I will say check if user or voter has already voted, and I'll say get voter should be equal to this and a synchronous function, of course, and I'll have a try catch. In the catch, I'll just log anything in the console, right? Any error we find. And so here the response should await axios.get process.env.react app API URL voters, and I want to get a particular voter, so I'll bring in the current voter ID. Okay, so instead of the voter elections that I'm getting from the Redux store, I'm actually going to get the voter ID. Yeah, I should get the ID right here. So I'll pass that in, voter ID. And of course, we need some options here. So with credentials is going to be true. I'll need some headers, authorization of bearer token. Okay, we have the token here already. I hope that makes sense. So here I'll say voted elections will be equal to, let's await response data dot voted elections. I hope that makes sense. All right, so here we can go ahead and say voted elections dot includes selected election. If it is true, or if the selected election is inside the voted elections array, then we are going to set can vote to be false. I hope that makes sense. All right, so in the use effect that we have here, I'll actually bring this down. And this use effect, we are going to call get voter as well. Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right, so yeah, they should actually do it. They should do it. Right. So let's go ahead, and error is not defined. One line is that, line 38. Error is not defined, error. Good. So now let's actually go ahead and see already voted. Okay. So John Doe has already voted in this particular election. I hope that makes sense. All right. So that is all we needed to do. And guys, I just want to try something. Okay. I'm trying to see if the if statement that I had earlier would actually work. All right, so I'll go ahead and comment this out, and in the use effect, I'll have, of course, I have to bring in the voter elections from the Redux store, and right here I'll have that if statement. That's just this right here. Of course, I have to, yeah, perfect. So let's see, get voter is not defined. Of course, I have to comment this out, and this actually works. Okay, this actually works, right? So it depends on you what you want to do. Okay, it depends on you what you want to do, really, right? But I am going to leave both in case you have any issue, which you shouldn't. I don't think you should have any issues with either of them, but you get the idea. There's the simplest way to check if the user has already voted in this particular election. I hope that makes sense. All right, so that's it for this candidates page. Of course, we should be able to actually vote a candidate before we work on the confirm election or the voting of the candidate. I want to go ahead and add a few more, I want to go ahead and add a few more candidates, okay, to the different elections that we have. Okay, so first of all, I have to log in as the admin, who is NS Achiever. So the email is achiever@gmail.com, and the password is achiever123. Okay, if I send this request, we should get, I'll just enter the path manually. So localhost 5000 API voters and then login. Okay, so let's go ahead and log in. And of course we get the token right here, so I'll just select that and come to the add candidate right here. And I messed up with the environment variable that I saved. Okay, so I'll just have to enter this manually as well. So instead of voted, this is going to be candidate and a post request. Of course, our bearer token is going to be the token that we just it shouldn't include the ID. It should not include the ID, so my bad. I'll just copy the token, come back to add candidate, and then paste that. With this, we can go ahead and add another candidate. Right, for the candidate image, I can choose this guy, and yeah, I'll just hit okay. The current election, that's the Legon election. Okay, so candidates added successfully. So if we come back here and actually come here, we should have two candidates. Okay, and we've already voted, so we cannot see them. And so I'll come back and add one more candidate, but I'll actually go ahead and let me come to the MongoDB, and in the elections I'll get the other, the ID of the other election. I'll get this ID just so we can have a candidate in there as well. Okay, all right, so where are we? Let's add candidate, and this time the ID is going to be the other election, right? And I'll say Vivian Geo, and for the image I'll select a lady's image right here. I'll say this is the third candidate, and let's go ahead and add this candidate as well. And candidates added successfully. So now we should actually have a candidate for this selection. If we refresh this page, we should have a candidate in here. Okay, perfect. All right, so of course, since we've not voted in this selection, you can see we have a candidate. Okay, we are not getting already voted. And actually I'll add a few more. And so I'll go ahead, choose a different image, and I'll say this is the fourth. And yeah, I'll just add this. And last one, I'll add one more person, a lady, and send. Perfect. All right, so if I come back and then refresh, we should have 3 candidates in here. Okay, and for the first one we should have 2. I hope that makes sense. Perfect. So let's go ahead and actually be able to vote in the elections. Okay, so to vote, of course, we should click this to open a modal, and once we open the modal, we are going to go ahead and fetch the candidate in that modal, and then just to confirm the candidate, and then we'll go ahead and vote that candidate. I hope that makes sense. So let's enter the confirm vote. Of course, in here we have confirm vote. The component is being rendered here. Okay, so I'll actually have a prop here, that's the selected election, and I'll pass it to the confirm vote component. Okay, when we were creating this, we actually had this dummy function to fetch the candidate, and we were fetching that from this dummy array. Okay, but now let's actually, okay, we have a state here already. So I'll just actually fetch something from the database. I will say get the candidate selected to be voted for. All right, so I'll have a try catch in here, and I'll log any error in the console. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in Axios. And so response, yes, I'll wait. Of course, this should be asynchronous now. Axios.get process.env.react app API URL. And if you check our route, we are trying to get a particular candidate. Okay, so that is a get request candidate and then the ID, right? So candidate and then the ID of the candidate. In this case, we should actually get that from the store, the Redux store. Okay, so how do we know that's the candidate we want to get? Let's see, if we go to the candidate, that's the singular candidate. When we open the candidate modal, we actually make sure we change the ID of the selected candidate. Okay, there is a reducer there to handle that. So we change and then we put in the ID of the selected candidate. I hope that makes sense. Right, so the candidate ID should be in the Redux store. So let's go ahead. Okay, so there's it. We are actually getting that from the Redux store. And so we are going to go ahead and paste it. Now, we should have some options. So with credentials is going to be true. We'll have some headers. Authorization is going to be bearer token. So bearer, and then we'll have a token. Now the token, we have to bring that in. Token should be equal to use selector state the vote current voter the token, right? So that's it. And once we get the response, we are going to set modal candidate to be the candidates we just got. So that will be response. Let me actually await response dot data. Perfect. All right, so I think that is it. And so let's go ahead and check this out. If I click, it should take a second, and for some reason it is not working. What could be the reason? Okay, custom object failed. Interesting. All right, you know what? Let's get in the candidate, and this ID should actually be underscore. Okay, this ID, of course, we can alias it to be an actual ID, and I think now we should have this working. So if I click, we actually get the candidate from the database. I hope that makes sense. All right, so we should be able to actually click confirm here to actually vote the candidate. Okay, so to do that, we are going to have, all right, so I'm going to have a function here. Confirm vote, a synchronous function. Await Axios dot patch. There's a patch request. if we check the route, you can see there's actually a patch request to vote a candidate, right? So of course, process.env react app, and then what is it, candidates, and then the ID. Okay, candidates and selected candidates. Okay, of course we need some options. So with credentials, true, headers, authorization, bearer, and then our token. Let's go ahead, and once we vote, we are going to get vote results. Okay, and that actually has the voted elections. Okay, that returns the voted elections. So I'll await response data, and I'm going to dispatch an action here. I hope we have our dispatch function. Okay, we have dispatch, and so I'll say vote actions dot change current voter, and I'm going to spread the old current voter. So let's go ahead and actually bring that in. So I'll say current voter, and I'll bring that object in, which has the ID, the token, the voted elections, and the admin. Okay, so I'm going to spread the current voter in an object, and here I want to update the voted elections. Okay, so now that will be the vote result. Okay, so I think that's the only thing we actually returned from that. Let me check that real quick. That's the vote candidate. I think that's what we vote casted successfully. Really, I think we should return the voter.voted elections. Okay, that's what we should return, right? Because that's what we are expecting. I hope that makes sense. All right, so yep, that's it. That's all we have to do here. And once the vote is casted, we can go ahead and navigate the user to the congrats page. So navigate. Of course, we should bring use navigate. Let's bring in use navigate. So we say navigate, and we are navigating to the congrats page. All right, so let's go ahead and try this. Of course, we should hook the right here on click is when we call the confirm vote. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this real quick. So far we don't have any votes for any of these candidates in the UNE presidential elections. Okay, so let's go ahead and vote John Dumelo. I'll confirm the vote, and we have a problem. What could that be? Interesting. I'm logging some things in the console. 20. And what's the actual problem though? Axios error. Response. Unauthorized. No token. Okay, really? Wait a minute. We have a token though. Current voter token. Bearer token. Authorization. What could be the problem, guys? Of course, we need a second option before the third option. Okay, the second option is going to be the election in which we are voting for this candidate. Right before the last options that we have here, we need to pass in the selected election. I should have a comma here, of course. And the selected election should actually be coming from the Redux store. And so let's go ahead and get that selected election. Use selector. Or we actually passed that in, okay, to the vote. We actually passed that into the confirm vote component that we rendered here. So we can go ahead and destructure that selected election. And yeah, just make sure you do that. All right, so let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to vote for, first let's check to see. So yeah, just so we make sure we don't have any votes here. All right, so let's go ahead and vote for John Dumelo. And I'll click confirm. And I've been redirected here, meaning everything went well. Now, if we return to the results page, you can see that John Dumelo has a vote. Okay. Of course, if we try voting in this particular election again, we shouldn't be able to vote. Okay. If I refresh this, okay, for some reason that is not working, and I think it's because of the changes that are made here. So I'm actually going to comment this out and then uncomment this, of course. Right, so now this should actually work. Okay, so some things just have to be experimented. Okay, so this is not the right way to do it. Just make sure you are doing it this way. That's why I had to walk you through both steps. All right, so we've already voted in this election, therefore we cannot vote again in this particular election. But of course, we can go ahead and vote in a different election. Okay, now if I vote for this person and check back, I should have one vote for this person. And as you can see, he has 33.33% of the votes in that particular election. All right, so that is also working. Now, what I want to do is once we click the confirm button, we should actually close that model. Okay, so I'll add that little touch before we close off. So actually I'm going to put this in a try catch, okay, and in case of anything I'll catch the error and then paste whatever I just copied in here. I just cut here. All right, so right after I vote, I'll go ahead and close candidate model, and we already have that in here, so perfect. All right, so that is it for the vote candidate or the confirm vote. And I think the next thing we need to move on to is the elections page right here. Okay, so we should be able to fetch elections, add elections, and update elections right here. All right, so let's move on to, actually I'm just going to close off these and I'll enter the elections component. All right, so let's go ahead and fetch all the elections from the database. And initially I'll have a loading state. Okay, so it's loading, set is loading, new state is going to be false initially. So once we hit this function, I'll set it to be true. process.env dot react app API URL elections with credentials set that to be true, and headers authorization bearer token. Of course, we should go ahead and bring in the token. Use selector, state, vote, current voter token. Right, and actually I'm going to bring in its admin as well. So it's admin. I'll bring in that. I'll bring that in as well. All right, for the is admin, I only want to show the, right here. Actually, it's not imported. So let's make sure we bring that in. All right, so this button right here, you have to be an admin to even see it, right? So here I would say it's admin. If it is true, then show the button. If not, we won't show it. So right now the logged in user is in an admin. That's why we are not seeing the button. So I'm going to log in as achiever 123, and now we should actually see it. Perfect. All right, so let's continue, and here I'll say set elections to be response data, or if you want you can go ahead and await. All right, so let's have that in a use effect. Let's call that function in a use effect. Get elections. Okay, so as you can see, this is what is actually coming from the database. Okay, what we had initially was just some dummy elections. So let's go ahead and delete the dummy elections, and initially it's going to be an empty array, and that's it. So for the is loading, I'm going to have that in here and say if is loading is true, then we want to show a loader. So let's bring in our loader. That's our loader component, which for some reason we have to bring that in manually. Loader from, that's in our components, and loader. Yeah, perfect. So if that is true, then so if it's loading is true, we need to show our loader. Otherwise, we are going to show the menu. I hope that makes sense. All right, now of course, once we are done fetching, we should actually set this loading to be false. Okay, so if I refresh, you should see a loading before we get the elections. So these are the elections coming from the database. All right, so now I think we should wait a minute. So the ID here should be underscore ID, of course. And if we enter the election component, I'll change the underscore ID to be an actual ID. I hope that makes sense. All right, so I think what we have to do is to be able to add election and update election. So far we've been able to fetch the elections, so what we need to do is to be able to add the election, as you can see here, and update an election. I think we should move on to adding the election. Okay, so that will be in the add election model component. That's where we are going to be able to add elections. And so quickly, let's go ahead and actually have a function here. I'll call this, come on, I'll call this create election is going to be an asynchronous function, and let's pass in an event, okay, and then prevent default. All right, I'll put this in the try catch, and in case we have any error, I'll just log it in the console as usual. All right, so I'll have election data. It's going to be new form data, right? And say election data dot set title should be equal to a title that we have. We have a title here, description, and then thumbnail, right? So we need description, and then thumbnail. Now let's go ahead and send a request to actually add the election. Process.env dot react app API URL elections election data. Okay, now we have to pass in some options. So we say with credentials is going to be true. You have some headers, and that'll be authorization, which is bearer token. All right, so response. Now once we add the election, we are going to refresh the page so that we can show that election. I hope that makes sense. So I'm actually going to bring in something from React Router DOM, and that's use navigate. So use navigate should be coming from React Router DOM, just so we can navigate to refresh the page. And even before I refresh the page, I'm going to go ahead and actually close the model. So I'll say close election model, and I don't think we have that function or that reducer here, so I'll go ahead and close selection model. It will dispatch UI actions. Oh, we have it. That is close model. That's this. Okay, that's this right here. So I'll just say close model. Right. So now this should actually be it. So let's go ahead, and token is not defined. Of course, we should bring in our token. We should bring in our token. Use selector. Use selector. State vote current voter token. Okay, and yeah, now let's go ahead and add one more election. Okay, perfect. I'm going to say Harvard presidential elections 2025. Wait a minute, I think I have an error in here. Description. Oh, right. And I'll say this is the description of the Harvard elections. All right, and for the thumbnail, I'll just select this. All right, now let's hit add election. And of course, it's not going to work because I forgot to add on submit and then pass in the create election function. Sorry about that. And of course, this should be a submit button. All right, so let's try this one more time. Harvard presidential election 2025. I'll just pass in a random text here. I'll choose this thumbnail and add election. Now let's see what happens, and boom, we have our Harvard presidential election. Okay, so everything is working for the add election component. Of course, the next thing we need to do is to be able to actually edit an election. Okay, so let's go on to make sure that happens, or that is done. So that will be the update election component right here. So the first thing we want to do is to actually fetch the election we want to update. Okay, we want to fetch that election and then pass in, wait a minute. We want to get the election from the database, passing the election values in the input here. Okay, so that we can edit it, and then we will choose a thumbnail and we'll update that election. I hope that makes sense. So let's go ahead and actually fetch the election from the database, or you can say get election. This is going to be asynchronous, of course, and I'll try catch console.log the error, and of course we need to bring in Axios, and this is a get request process.env.react app API URL elections, and then the ID of the election. Now the ID, wait a minute, if we check the vote slice, I think that is the ID of election to update. Okay, so let's get that from the Redux store. I'll just have that here, ID of election to update, use selector, state vote, ID of election to update. Perfect. All right, so I'll pass that in here, and of course I'm going to have some options here. With credentials is going to be true. I'll have some headers with authorization of bearer token. Beautiful. All right, so once we have that from the database, we are going to go ahead and set title to be, actually I'll just say selection should be equal to await response data. Right, so here that will be election.title, and I'll set the description as well, election.description. That will be set description. I hope that makes sense. All right, so once we have that, of course we should make sure we actually call the function inside the use effect. So I will say fetch election. Beautiful. All right, so token is not defined. Of course, I always keep forgetting the token. That's current voter token. All right, so now if I hit this, I should get that what is happening. Okay, it's not working for some reason, and let's see why it's not working. Let's go into the election, and when we click on the edit, we call open model, and when we open a model, we want to update the ID of the election we just clicked on. Okay, so I'm actually going to dispatch another reducer here, and that's going to be from the vote actions, and that will be change ID of election to update. Selected election. Do I have that? Change ID of candidate, change ID of candidate's ID. All right, I think I made a mistake here. There should be change ID of election to update. Okay, so ID of election to update right here. I'll pass that in. All right, so once we click on the election edit button, we are going to change ID of election to update, and then we'll pass in the ID of that particular election right here. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So now this should actually work. When we click, we should fill in the titles, and it's still not working for some reason. I'll just refresh and click, and it's still not working, guys. What is going on? We don't have any errors. Date 26. Cannot read properties of undefined title. All right, let's check that out. 26. Election.title. Okay, so you are probably not getting the election. Process.env elections and the election ID. In other words, I'll just log the ID of the election I'm trying to console.log. I'll log that in the console just so we see whether. Alright, so when I click edit, I actually have the ID. If I select a different selection, you can see that's a different ID. Okay, so we are getting the ID, but for some reason we are not being able to fetch it from the database. Okay, so axios.get process.env react app API URL elections / the ID. Await, guys. Oh my bad. So we should just await, and they should do it. Okay, so now if we click, we actually get the title and the description filled already. Okay, so we can go ahead and make any changes we want, and we can go ahead and select a thumbnail. So for this, I'm actually going to change the thumbnail, and this Harvard flag, so I'll just select that. And for now, we don't have the function to actually update it, so let's go ahead and work on that. So let's have on submit prop on the form, and it's going to call the update election function that we are about to create. So let's have that function, update election. It's going to be asynchronous, of course. And let's put this in a try catch. But of course, I'm going to prevent the default submission. So e.prevent default. let's go ahead and create a new form data. So I'll say election data, new form data, and I'll have the title, description, and all that in this. That'll be the title. I'll duplicate this twice. We need description and then thumbnail. All right, now we can go ahead and send a request. Let's await Axios dot, there's going to be a patch request. Okay, so axios.patch process.env dot react app API URL, and we are going to elections and then the ID of the election we want to update. So that is ID of election to update. And the next one is going to be with credentials. We are going to set that to be true. We will need some headers, and here authorization is going to be the bearer token. And once we update, we are actually going to refresh the page. So I'll say navigate 0. I don't know if we have navigate, so we have to bring in use navigate. So I'll say navigate should be able to use navigate. And once we finish with everything, before we even refresh the page, I'm actually going to close the model. Okay, and that should do it. This should do it. All right, so let's go ahead and actually make sure this is possible. So I'm going to select the Harvard badge or flag again, and I'm going to hit update selection, and let's see what happens. Okay, the page refreshes, and as you can see, we have a new election here. Okay, now of course I didn't make any real changes because it's only the thumbnail, but if I go ahead and add anything here or remove anything from here and choose the Harvard flag again and update, you can see we have those changes. So everything on this page is done, and we should move on to the last page that we have, and that should be the election details page. I'm going to go ahead and remove all the stuff that we don't need. These dummy data or those dummy arrays, I'm going to remove them, and I'll remove this. I'll remove this as well. What else? I'll comment this out as well, at least for now. And now let's see what happens. Okay, current selection is not defined. Right here, I'll remove all these. I just want to get rid of that error. Okay, I don't understand how I'm being redirected to an error page, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove all these. I'll comment this out as well. And now if we go to the election details page, we actually get it. All right, so let's work on this. Of course, we should get the election so that we can show the election title, the thumbnail, and the description here. We will get the candidates that belongs to this election, and we'll get the voters or the people that have voted in this particular election as well. All right, so let's quickly do that. As you can see, we are getting the ID of the election from the params. Okay, so we can go ahead and get the election. That's the first thing we want to do. So I will say get election. I think I'll have a state here. It's loading, a loading state. Set is loading. Set is loading. Use state, and initially it's going to be false. But once we start fetching, I'm going to set it to be true. Okay. I'll put this in a try catch, and in the catch I'll just log any error in the console. So I'll wait. Axios.get process.env.react app API URL elections, and then the ID of the election, which in this case is this ID. You have some options. So with credentials, it's going to be true. You have some headers. Authorization is going to be the bearer token. And that's it. Okay, so we should be able to get the election. Now I'm going to have an array here, and initially the elections is going to be an empty array. So I'll say set elections. So use state and we'll pass in an empty array, right? But once we get the election back, we are going to set elections. Set election, and then that will be the response data, right? And of course, we are going to call this function in a use effect. So I'll say get election. All right, so now, okay, so we don't have Axios, we don't have the token as well. I'll import Axios from Axios, and I'll bring in our token. So I'll duplicate this token. That should be coming from the vote and current voter, and then we get the token. Now that we have our election, let's go ahead and actually display that in here. So we'll have the election title, we'll have the election image or the thumbnail, we'll have, so far let's save and see what we have. Oh, this should be singular election. Okay, so we have the election title, we have the image, we should have the description as well. I think right here we should have the election description. There we go. What else? Of course, if you want, you can have an alt, and that'll be, I'll make that election title. And yeah, that's enough. Okay, so that's for the election itself. Now let's go ahead and actually fetch the candidates that belongs to this particular election. So I'll say get candidate. This is going to be an asynchronous function as well. Try catch. In case of anything, we will log that in the console. And I'm actually going to have that in here. I'm going to have a state for that as well. So candidate, set candidate is going to be an empty array. We will say response should be equal to await axios.get process.env react app API URL, and here elections and the election ID, and then candidates. That should get us the candidates of the selection. With credentials is going to be true. You have some headers. Authorization is going to be bearer token. Right. So once we have that, we are going to say set candidates and then response dot data. Okay, so once we have that, we can actually go ahead. Let me uncomment this. So I'll say candidate, and then we map through the candidates. So now let's see what happens. Okay, we have some issues. Of course, there should be an underscore. What else? Of course, we should call get candidates. That's the function. We should call that in the use effect. And now if I save and come back, we are actually getting the candidates from the database. Okay. Now if I come back here and then choose a different election, okay, that's the first one I chose. If I choose a different election, you can see that we are getting the candidates that belongs to that particular election. I hope that makes sense. All right, so that is for the candidates. And the next thing we want to do here is to fetch the voters. Okay, the voters of the selection. That will be get voters. I'll have a state for that as well. So I'll duplicate this. I'll have voters and then set voters. It's going to be an empty array as well. This is an asynchronous function, of course. Try catch. In case of anything, we will just log it in the console. And so I'll just copy this right here, then paste, and that should be voters, and that's it. Okay, that's it. So here I'll say set voters and then pass in response dot data. I hope that makes sense. All right, so of course down here in the table I'll uncomment this, and here the ID will be, of course we have to go ahead and call this get voters function in the use effect. So now you can see we have only one voter in this particular election. Okay, if we check, that's actually correct. Okay, we have only one voter in here. But if we check the first one, you can see that we have 3 voters. Okay, we have John Doe, Jane Doe, and then James Kofi. I hope that makes sense, guys. So I think in here in the voters, this should be the voter dot created at. Okay, that's what I'm going to use here. Now of course you can go ahead and actually format this to make it look good, but I'll just leave it like this. That's not very important for us right now, so I'll just leave it like this. I think the last thing we want to do here is to be able to delete an election. Okay, we should have a delete button here to be able to delete an election. All right, so I have to make sure we have that in place. And of course, even with the button to add a candidate, you have to be an admin to do that, to even see the button. Okay, so I'll bring its admin from the, let me just duplicate this, its admin. I'll bring that from the current user, and if it is true, then we can go ahead and show the add candidate. the add candidate button. Okay, so right now NS Achiever is the logged in user, that's why we can see it. And also we should have a delete button. All right, so down here below the menu here, I'm going to have is admin, and if it is true, then we want to have a button here. And here I'll give it a class name of btn danger, and then full. I'll give it an on-click prop as well, and now I'll call a function called delete election. The text will say delete election. So delete election, of course, is not defined, so let's go ahead and have delete election. Right, so we should have a button here that we can click to actually delete an election. Before I delete an election, I think right here, okay, right here, you have to be an admin. You have to be an admin to be able to see this edit button. Okay, when you come to the elections page, you have to be an admin to see this button, right? So I don't know if we have the is admin. We don't. So I'll say const is admin. Use selector. Come on. State vote current voter is admin. Okay, so if is admin is true for the current logged in user, then we are going to show this edit button. Otherwise it will not even be showing. I hope that makes sense. Right now we are logged in as Achiever, that is why we can see it. Right, so let's move on and actually be able to delete an election. So let's have that function real quick. I'll just put this in a try catch. Console.log error response await axios delete, that's the request. Process.env react app API URL and elections, and we need the ID of the election, so that will be ID, right? Perfect. Of course, we should go ahead and have some options. So with credentials is going to be true, of course. Authorization bearer token. All right, of course this should be asynchronous, and this should actually be enough to delete the election. Now once we delete an election, we shouldn't be on the same page, right? So we should navigate to, all right, I have to bring in use navigate, so I'll go ahead and we should navigate to the elections page. And so that's it. Okay, now let's go ahead and try deleting an election. So far we have this election that is empty basically, so I'll just go ahead and try deleting it, and it's been deleted. Right now if I refresh, of course I didn't refresh earlier, but it was there, but now it's gone. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Of course we can go ahead and try adding a new election, and I will just choose this as the thumbnail for that particular election. And so we have this election right here. If I refresh the elections collection, you can see that we have that. Okay, but of course we can go ahead to actually delete this particular election. Okay, so I think we are almost done with the whole thing, and the last thing remaining is add candidates and also delete candidates. Okay, So we should go ahead to actually make sure this works, and I think we should be able to delete candidates first. Right here, where is it? Okay, and I think we should go ahead and be able to delete candidates. So I'll go to election candidates right here, and in here we need underscore ID. Okay, and I'm going to alias it back to ID. Right, and to delete election, of course I'm going to bring in Axios, and I'll have a function here, delete election, and sorry, delete candidate. Okay, yeah, working on deleting candidate. So delete candidate is going to be an asynchronous function, of course. I'll put this in a try catch in case of any errors. I'll just log that in the console. So of course this is going to be the same request we've been sending. So response blah blah blah, and I'll just paste that in here. So this is going to be a delete request to, let me check that route real quick. Delete candidate. Okay, so candidates and then the ID, right? We should be in here. So candidate and then the ID of that candidate, right? And I think that's it. Okay, so the only thing we need here is the token. So use selector, state, vote, current voter, and then the token. Right, so once we delete, we are just going to refresh the page. Okay, so I'll just bring in use navigate as well, and I'll say navigate to the same page. All right, so let's try this quickly, and of course on click of this button is when I want to call the delete candidate. Okay, so let's go ahead and try deleting one of these candidates. I'm going to delete this person, and she's been deleted. Okay, so even if we check the elections right now, you can see there are 3 candidates in here, but now there are 2. Okay, I can go ahead and delete one more person, and now if I refresh the elections page, we have, wait a minute, sorry, the candidates page, we should have just 1 person. I'll just refresh one more time. Interesting. I'll go ahead and delete the last person, and let's see what happened. Okay, so if you paid attention, you would know that I was looking at the wrong election. Okay, so there's the election whose candidates were being deleted, and as you can see right now we have 0 candidates in this election, right? And that's the beauty of the, of the relationships that we established using sessions, right? The Node Express API, you remember we established some relationship between the different collections. So in this particular case, we established that relationship between the candidates and the elections they belong to. So once we delete the candidates, we make sure the candidates array in that particular election is the ID of that particular candidate in the candidates array here in the election is removed. I hope that makes sense. All right, so that is the beauty of making this feel like a relational database. All right, so the last thing we want to do is to be able to add candidates. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Add candidate modal. I have a function here called add candidate. It's going to be asynchronous, of course. And in case of anything, we'll just log that in the console. All right, so let's prevent defaults, of course. I'll create a new form data. So candidate data or candidate info, whatever, is equal to new form data. And I'll say candidate info dot set full name. You need a full name, and that's going to be equal to the full name that we have in the state. I'll duplicate this a few times. So we need full name, we need motto of that candidate, and we need an image of that candidate. And I think that's it. Actually, I'll pass in the current election as well. Okay, beautiful. All right, so I'll go ahead and send the request. I'll just await Axios. Of course, we have to bring in Axios. Let's import Axios from Axios. So let's bring in axios.post process.env.react app API URL /candidates, and I think that should be it. Okay, of course we need to pass in the data, that's the candidate info, and the options. I'll say with credentials should be true. We'll pass in some headers. Authorization is going to be bearer and then token, right? And that should be it. Now once we add a user, we should reload the page to show that user. So I'll bring in use navigate, and I'll say navigate 0. All right, so let's go ahead and actually try this. Of course, we should have on submit on this form, and that should call the add candidate function. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this. Current selection is not defined, token is not defined. Okay, interesting. Let's go ahead and bring in token. So use selector, state, vote, current voter, and then the token. And what use selector? What did they say? Current selection is not defined. I just call the selection ID, and that should be in the add candidate election ID. Wait a minute, let me check that real quick. So we have add candidate selection. Yeah, perfect. Change add candidate selection ID. So you know what, where we open the modal, that is inside the election details page. Once we open the modal, we should actually be able to, right here in this function, where is that function? Right here, we should be able to update the election ID. Okay, so this reducer right here is what we are going to use. Change add candidate election ID. Okay, so yep, that's what we want to use, and this should be in the, yeah. So let's dispatch an action here, and sorry, this is going to be a vote action. So change whatever, and then we'll pass in the ID of the election, which we have here. Okay, we have in the params right here. All right, so once we have that, we can go ahead and get the add candidate election ID in here in the modal. I hope that makes sense. So I'll just paste this. So now we should have the election ID. All right, so instead of current election, this should be election ID. All right, so that's it. Now let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to add a candidate to this current election. That's the UNER presidential election. And so I'm going to just refresh to make sure you see that there are no candidates so far in that particular election. Okay, so the candidates array in this election is empty. Let's go ahead and try adding, I don't know, Jack Ma. I'll just have something random for the motto, and then we'll choose an image. I'll just choose Ronaldo here and add candidate. Let's see what happens. Boom, we have Jack Ma. Okay, and if we refresh our elections collection, now this election has a candidate. Okay, and that candidate is Jack Ma right here. Okay, so we can actually add more candidates. I'll just add Vivian Gel, and I'll select this image, and we have it. Okay, so if you come to the results page, you can see that we actually have these people. I hope that makes sense. If I log in as John Doe, so the password John123. As you can see on this page, I cannot add elections. Here too, I cannot add candidates and all that because I am not an admin. Okay, so far some of the authorization functionalities are done, but now I think the last thing we want to do before we finish up with this entire application is to have some access control. Okay, the access control is going to be pretty simple. Let's go into our logout page, and yeah, I'm not going to even return anything, guys. I'll just have a React fragment, but then before I return, I'll go ahead and I'll have a dispatch. Use dispatch. Now I'll put this in a use effect, and just say once we come to this page or this component, we are going to dispatch vote actions and say change current voter, and we are just going to set it to now. And once we set it to now in the Redux store, we are going to go ahead and remove it from the local storage where we saved it as well. So local storage dot remove item, and we are going to remove the current user. That's what we called it, I think. Let's check real quick. If we go to applications right here, current user, that's the name we gave it. Okay, and so let's go ahead. So you just remove that, and now once we remove it, we are going to go ahead and redirect to the login page. Sorry, use navigate. So navigate to the login page. And right here, you can see in the nav bar, we can have access to all these routes, okay, which shouldn't be showing if we are not logged in. I hope that makes sense. Right now, I think we are having some issues. I'm not sure what is going on. Okay, since, as you can see, since we are logged out, a lot of the things are not showing because we don't have our token, and that is because we have set the current user to now. Okay, so we don't have the token to actually make the request to the API. I hope that makes sense. And so once we are logged out, we are going to actually remove all these links. Okay, so let's go to our nav bar. I'm going to say if we have token, then we should show our nav menu right here. Okay, so of course we should bring in our token. I'll just put it here, token. If token is true, or if we have a token, then we can go ahead and actually show our menu. Right, but of course, as you can see, we can access the elections page, for instance. So let's go ahead and do more than we've done already. We are going to use the token to check if we can even access some components. Okay, so I'll just come here to the pages that we have, starting with the candidates page. And I'll say if we do not have any token, then we are not going to go ahead and do anything. Right, so right here, I'll just bring the token way up and have that access control. So I'll put this in a use effect and say I'll have an empty dependency array, and I'll say if we do not have token, then we shouldn't even be able to access this page. I hope that makes sense. So we will just navigate you to the home page. Where is the login page? Okay, so that is it. Now I'll copy this and paste it on all the pages. Okay. Right, of course we should go ahead and bring in token. Right, so I'll copy this here as well, come to the election details page and paste that up top, and here we have the token already, so I'll just remove this. And the next page is the elections page. Navigate is not defined. That's on what page? Congrats page, candidates page, election details page. And of course I'll go back, navigate. I have to bring that in. Cons navigate, use navigate. Candidates page. Of course, I have to bring that in. Use navigate. What else? The congrats page, I have it. Election details page. Okay, I think we have we have use navigate here. So congrats page, use effect. You have to bring that in as well. And yeah, so now if I do this in the elections page, let's see what happens. I'll just paste right here. I'll just paste, and we have the token here already, so we don't have to bring it, and it should be navigate like that. I'll just copy this again, I'll bring the token way up. All right, so we cannot access the elections page without logging in. All right, so that is the access control. I'll just copy and then paste it on the remaining pages. For the login and register pages, we don't need that, but for the results page, we do need it. So I'll just come here and then paste, and I'll just remove the token down here. And yeah, we just have to bring in use navigate. And that should be it. Okay, so if we go to the results page as well, we should be redirected back here. Of course, if you want, you can add that here in the other components, like the add, candidates components and all that. But I think there is enough. And so let's go ahead and test this whole thing out. I think we are completely done with the entire application. So let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to log in as the admin. That's achiever@gmail.com. Achiever123 is the password. Of course, if I enter a wrong password, I should get an error, invalid credentials. Okay, but now I'll make the password correct and I'll log in. All right, in here, of course, I can go ahead and add an election. I'll say most popular people in history. I'll just have some dummy text for the description, and for the thumbnail, I'll just choose something very random. I'll actually choose one of my thumbnails here and then add this selection. All right, so we have this selection. Of course, if we try voting in this selection, we shouldn't be able to. We have inactive election. There are no candidates found for this selection. Please check back later. Okay, so all those checks are also working. Now, if we go ahead and actually add candidates for this selection, let's see, I'll just add the images first. I'll just go ahead and add the images, and let's add Chem. Just have something random. I'll add this candidate. Okay, so she's been added. I'll add one more person. Let's say Michael Jackson. For the motto, I'll just have something random. I'll add this candidate as well. And I'll add one more person, Cristiano. I'll have something random for the motto as well. Now let's add him. All right, and now when we come here, we can actually vote in this particular election. Okay, so if you vote Michael Jackson, now remember I'm logged in as NS Achiever. Although he's an admin, he's also a voter, so you can go ahead and vote. And once you vote, you are redirected here to the congrats page, and you can go ahead and see the results. So far, Michael Jackson is the only person who is being voted for. Okay, so he has 100% of the votes, right? I haven't voted in this election, so I can actually go ahead and vote in this one as well. And let's see, there are no votes here, and there are no votes here as well. So I can vote here in this particular election. And of course, if I try voting again in this particular election, I'm going to get already voted. Okay, you are only permitted to vote once in an election. And if I try voting in this one as well, I'm going to get already voted. I hope that makes sense. So all these checks are working, guys. All these are working, and everything is looking amazing. Okay, of course, I can go ahead and actually change or edit this election. Instead of most popular people in history, I can do most famous people in the world, and I'll keep the description, and I can choose a different thumbnail for this. I'll just use the Harvard flag, and if I update, boom, I have it. Now it's most famous people in the world. Okay, we still have the same candidates, and we still have that person who voted in this election. Of course, we can go ahead and delete this election, and it should be no more right here. We can go ahead and delete all the elections if we want. This one is also gone, as you can see, and I can go ahead and delete this as well. Okay, so everything is working, guys. Everything is working. Now if I log out, you can see I'm completely logged out. Okay, so that is it for this entire application. I hope you really learned something. Now I think the last thing I want to do is to deploy this application. That's the API and the client side. Okay, we are going to deploy both the Node Express API and the client side, that is the React application as well. And then I'll teach you how they will be able to communicate back and forth with each other. So watch out for that video where I'll teach you how to deploy a MERN stack full stack application.